This podcast is made possible by Plantful. Hi, it's Jack Sweeney. Welcome to a special episode of Planning Aces, where we pay tribute to top consultant, mentor, and friend to many, Steve Player, who of course was also our co-host here at Planning Aces. There was a number of approaches I considered taking with this episode, but given Steve represents a standalone chapter in the careers of so many people, I thought what might work best is for me to simply share my Steve Player chapter with you. It's what I know best, and therefore will likely have the most to offer. You'll find I include different audio clips featuring Steve throughout the episode. This is to lessen the burden of having to listen to me for the next 30 minutes. We post this episode while offering our deepest sympathies to Steve's family this holiday season. Our tribute to Steve Player begins after this. With so much change around us and your need for increasing agility, you have to equip your team to win, and you have to do it now. Join over 1,300 companies of all sizes using Planful to help plan and execute with greater confidence. Planful integrates your critical financial processes to serve the data you need, insights you demand, and the answers necessary to manage your business optimally. Planful lets you plan better, close faster, and report more accurately. And Planful's not just for finance and accounting. It's for the entire business to plan, collaborate, and drive increased financial performance. Take full control of how you administer and manage all of your financial processes and data. And put finance first collaboration at the heart of every decision. When finance is a team sport, you can be a champion. With Planful, you'll be a champion of finance. Get in the game by going to planful.com to learn more. December 30th, 2022. When consultant Steve Player died last month at the age of 64, the business function that he had tormented, ridiculed, and warhammered for more than 2 decades stood quivering in the shadows. Still breathing, the beast of a business process known as budgetary control had withstood its most notorious assailant's heaviest blows, in itself a resounding tribute to those industry high priests who had given the process life in the first half of the 20th century. However, many agree that it's only a matter of time before budgetary control succumbs to its many injuries and a proper warrant is issued certifying the death of a business function that may have served all of industry better had it lived only half as long. It's just such an acknowledgment that makes Steve Player and others of his ilk appear to be as worthy of our acclaim as those who helped to institutionalize this business function in the first place. Perhaps it's no surprise that both groups have been made up mainly of management consultants, a clan that I know only too well, or so I thought until I met Steve Player.
One thing I like about this podcast, we're interviewing a senior finance leader who's made it all the way to CFO. We get to look back on their long career to different moments. And in clips like these, we get to time travel. We get to go back to the thing that, as he said in his own words, made him want to become a CFO. And when I think about that, I think about all the finance professionals I've interacted with over my long career. To be there when the guy says, this is what made me, he's not closing the books, he's not booking transactions, he's not doing the reconciliation, he's not trying to explain the variance. He's working hand to hand with business people, trying to understand their product, understand their customer behavior, and figure it all out. If you aspire to be an FP&A, or if you ever want to lead an FP&A team, you need to listen to that clip, because that's what FP&A, when it's doing its work properly, is really doing. Yes, we'll get to forecasting, we'll get to a lot of that sexier mathematical stuff, but in its essence, it's working with business people, marketing, sales, production. It's working on a problem and sorting through. And you got to imagine, think about this. This guy's a really young guy in his career. He's parachuted in. Hey, go help these guys. He's given what I would assume at the company would have been considered an easy assignment. Hey, go work with those guys who are hitting the home run. That thing's going off the charts. How would you like to be the guy that drops in there and you start looking at that and you say, wait a minute here, something doesn't feel right. And that's a good clue for FP&A people. The metrics may be saying one thing, but if you're in your heart, if your gut says, hey, something's not right here, that's what you got to trust your instincts and say, wait a minute, let me look at this. Let me go deeper. And lots of us, if you ever had an uh-oh moment, this is a great example of an uh-oh, and you got to really dig in and figure what that's about.
Back in 2007, I had been working at Penton Media in New York City for only a few days when the caller ID field of my newly issued phone filled with green neon type that read, "The Player Group." Steve quickly introduced himself and congratulated me on being named editor of Business Finance, a monthly print magazine that regularly featured CFO interviews conducted by none other than Steve. From what I recall, I asked Steve one or two questions about his next CFO interview before he asked me about my former employer, Consulting Magazine, where I had spent the previous 7 years as editor-in-chief. I responded by telling Steve that I could likely spot the shake, rattle, and roll of a rainmaking consultant a mile away. Steve seemed amused. Before our call ended, Steve asked me whether I had yet gotten a copy of Reinventing the CFO, a 2006 text published by Harvard Business Review Press. Somewhat surprised by the question, I explained that on the day that I arrived at Penton, I found a copy of Reinventing the CFO waiting for me on my desk. Steve seemed pleased and encouraged me to take a read. Over the next year, Steve and I would speak at least monthly as he filed his CFO interviews, a task that was often coordinated with several calls involving the player group team, but one that would almost always include a call from Steve. It was during one of our calls that I told Steve that I had been researching some history related to budgetary control, and that I thought he might find it interesting. At the time, I was attempting to chart the speed and reach with which budgeting control had originally been adopted by industry. I'd become convinced that James O. McKinsey, the founder of the firm that bears his name, more than any one person, had been responsible for kicking things off. Steve was fascinated, and our rambling discussion became the first of many that we would have about the evolution of business processes. Once, when I was writing an article involving the history of Arthur Andersen, Steve unexpectedly knocked on my door one afternoon and presented me with 2 thick volumes featuring essays written by Arthur Andersen's former chairman and chief executive, Harvey Kapnick. Apparently, Steve had carried the books with him on a flight from Texas.
You don't have to unbuild something. So a lot of people, when you come in, you inherit something that's not the way you want it to be. It's not respected. It has a bad. I got to tell you, I'd rather have no culture and build it from scratch than come in and have a bad culture that I've got to figure out how to take out and replace with a good culture. So the huge advantage of building from scratch is you get to build what you want. It's like, okay, you're not inheriting and you're not moving into somebody else's house. You're going to design and build your house the way you want to. Now, it's hard, no question about it. It's hard, but as he built it, he gave us some pretty good clues as kind of work through that. He hired the right personality type. That's the first time I think I've heard a CFO talk about hiring FP&A for the right personality type. And he's really trying to hire somebody that's going to be a partner, going to be collaborative, not looking for a policeman. Lots of times in finance, we get the role of being the corporate cop. We're the compliance insurers and those kind of things, and those are important roles, but that's a different personality type in terms of what's out there. So he's looking for somebody that really wants to partner and epitomize the business partnering. So he screens for the personality type. The key kind of the proof, if you will, that they're getting where they want to be is when he says that these people respect the work that comes out of the team. If you're an FP&A team and you want to say, hey, are we doing good or not? Ask the question, does the company respect the work that we're doing? Have we earned their respect? Because that's something that's not just readily given. You got to go out there and you got to earn it. And are you working on the right initiatives? Are you in there and the initiatives he talked about? I mean, Norfolk Southern is coming out of. They're trying to get their service back in place. He's working. They're not doing. They're not trying to figure out how to do lease accounting. They're working on things that are integral to the health and the well-being of the company as a whole. And that's where you want people to kind of be inserted and kind of what they're tapping into.
Perhaps a dozen Steve Player CFO interviews later, the Player Group once more filled my caller ID field. This time it was Steve himself, seeking to confirm my attendance at an upcoming conference in San Francisco, where if all went as planned, Steve assured me I could have a sit-down with Jeremy Hope, the author of Reinventing the CFO and co-founder of the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable, a not-for-profit collaborative. Steve, who served as the BBRT's program director for North America, had already sent me a number of Jeremy's other books, with titles such as Beyond Budgeting and Transforming the Bottom Line. At the time, I found Steve's use of the term sit-down a little odd, but looking back, I know that this was intended to signal the high regard that Steve had for Jeremy. It would only be a few years later that Jeremy unexpectedly died. At the San Francisco conference, I shared with both Jeremy and his North American nobleman, Steve, some survey results of Business Finance's readership that showed that 2 out of 3 finance executives expected their 2009 budgets to be obsolete within the first 6 months of the year, while 28% of them reported that their budgets had been obsolete before 2009 had even begun. What's more, I shared with Steve and Jeremy a mock-up of our next cover of the magazine, something that an editor should probably never do, as I wanted to convince them both that I was committed to writing and editing a cover story on the collapse of budgetary controls. My cover story that quoted Jeremy widely would be published about a month later. Unfortunately, budgetary controls were not the only victim of the economic downturn at the time, as the terminations of many print publications were also put in motion by the collapse. Convinced that there were few opportunities left at Penn, I exited the world of print publishing and began my own journey of reinvention, which proved to be far longer and far more costly than I had ever imagined.
How can you be future ready when you can't predict a pandemic? We're all aware there may be another one, but we're as I like to tell people, we're post-shutdown, but we're not post-pandemic, and we never will be post-pandemic. The COVID virus will be with us just like the flu virus is from here on. We just have to learn to live with it. The war in Europe, caught many off guard. The energy prices have going from, we had a lot of energy, now all of a sudden the prices are skyrocketing. And that's all about supply and demand and the impact of the war. Inflation, recession, all this stuff whipsaws in a relatively short period of time. And that's the reason the only way to deal with that is to be agile, because you cannot predict. You can't line up to go one way, because as soon as you get lined up, it's going to whipsaw and go the other way. So to do that, we really have to focus on how to be agile. When you think about finance, moving to being an agile finance is about digitization. It's taking advantage of technology in terms of what's out there. It's about converting a lot of the old manual, labor-intensive clerk duties, and I'll call them monkey work, for lack of a better term. If y'all saw that careerbuilder.com, I believe it was careerbuilder.com, had a commercial where Bob walked in the office as monkeys were throwing paper everywhere. That's an example of monkey work. It's clerical. It's, and I don't mean to disparage monkeys, so we don't need letters from the zoo population, but finance will always have to pay the bills, collect the receivables, book the transactions. Finance will always have to keep the wheels running. But we need to figure out how to do that as simple and as fast as possible, and then use computers to do that because it makes it simpler and faster, and then take that brain power and those hands that we've freed up and use them differently and move them into strategic roles where they're analyzing, where they're thinking, and they're working on really, really strategic problems. And if we think about finance transformation, you want to be agile to better support strategic decision making.
That there are few things more useless than a print editor without a magazine is a bit of logic that most professionals might find hard to refute, with the exception of Steve Player. For some reason, Steve kept calling. "We've got to keep the wolf away from the door," was his often repeated refrain. I remember thinking at the time how much it meant that he used the word we. Honestly, if you ever want to feel safe in your home, just imagine Steve Player stationed on your front stoop with a double-edged axe resting on one shoulder. However, Steve was more than just words. He looked for opportunities to have me participate at his conferences and encouraged me to get out and go to other industry events. It was during this period of reinvention that I began to observe more closely the connection that Steve had made with his audiences. Instead of watching Steve talk, I began watching the attendees in the audience and how they responded to the blunt reprimands that he gave them in reference to what he referred to in his repertoire as dumb stuff. The finance professionals seated in the audience knew he was right. They knew that large portions of their days and nights were focused on budget targets that just didn't matter. And here was this guy bearing witness in public to the everyday madness of their professional lives. "Finance has got to stop doing dumb stuff," was the favorite phrase that got heads nodding and blood circulating. A number of Steve's presentations that I attended felt more like church revival meetings than gatherings of finance and accounting professionals. Of course, Steve might have been the first to agree that there's not a lot of difference between expunging a worn-out business process and exercising the devil. Along the way, Steve let me know if I could scrape the airfare together to attend the next conference, I could crash at his hotel room for the night. I tried not to take him up on that, but I feel that it's important to mention this because, after all, who is it that makes such an offer?
Few people know that I went to the University of North Texas, which has got one of the finest music schools in the world. They're 1 O'Clock Lab Band's one of the only college groups that's ever been nominated for, I think, 3 or 4 Grammys. They are really, really good. But the whole thing about jazz is there's an underlying cadence, there's an underlying rhythm that has everything fitting together. And the musicians the really good bands are the ones that just kind of come together instinctively. They get on the same cadence, they get together. And what Scott's really talking about is the cadence. And how do you create that? It's an easy thing to say, but how do you create that? You can change everything about your company simply by changing the questions you ask. And the questioning is what gets, to me, it's the orchestration behind the band. The questions trigger the cadence. What questions are you trying to answer? How frequently? How do you get the people to come together to kind of, and Scott uses a word I really, really like, trying to create an accountability and trying to create a healthy tension. When you think about an athlete training, to train, you don't want to be too stressed and hurt yourself. But if you're not stressed enough, you're not working and improving. So you want a healthy tension. And that's what we want for our businesses. We want a very healthy tension so that we're always striving. We're getting the best out of people. We're asking the questions that keep us on point, keep us working in terms of what's out there. So that's what you're really striving for. And he talked about you got to get the right people in the right conversation with the right metrics. Okay. And you start at the beginning. If you don't have that at all, you just start and say, okay, what should we be talking about? How frequently? Who should be in the conversation? Everything. And that, the who you're asking the question to is really creating that kind of accountability. And that's where you're going to start. If you don't know much, you're going to start high and then you're going to keep going deeper. And what happens over time is through your FP&A function, you mature as an organization by asking richer questions, not just talking about the end results and trying to explain variances, but getting back into what causes those end results to occur.
As months turned into years, I found myself attending a conference with Steve when it occurred to me that many finance leaders were in need of a narrative reboot. In short, they needed to begin explaining themselves and their career experiences in a more engaging way to which larger numbers of executives could relate. At the same time, I realized that mobile technologies could play a big role in the reboot. I was not yet familiar with the podcasting world, but I felt that if my information resource could feature the actual voices of business leaders, we could shed some light on each leader's emotional intelligence. I would launch the CFO Thought Leader podcast in 2014, and the years that followed, Steve and I routinely found new ways to collaborate. For every quasi-milestone that the podcast achieved, Steve was ever ready to serve up kudos and ideas for making the show better. When the pandemic arrived in North America, I approached Steve with the idea of co-hosting a monthly podcast wherein he could explore in greater depth some of the FP&A ideas and commentary being shared by CFOs on CFO Thought Leader. Steve suggested the name Planning Aces, and we launched under that name a few months later. Together, we co-hosted 16 episodes, in which Steve was without question the star, no matter how many CFOs we featured. After our last recording session on October 28th, I'd made a mental note to kick off the next episode by reminding Steve that 2022 is the 100th anniversary of James O. McKenzie's On Budgeting, the first book ever published on budgetary control. McKenzie was an assistant professor at the University of Chicago when he decided to take a stab at becoming the first academic to approach the subject of budgetary control as a whole, rather than zero in on particular aspects of budgeting procedures. I knew that a reference to McKenzie would stir the pot and leave Steve to open the door to a chapter of history that he probably knew and understood better than anybody. History was always at Steve's command. Business historian and lecturer Christopher McKenna of the Sade Business School has long argued that McKenzie was not an innovator because of his skills or cost accounting practices, but because he was able to institutionalize his practices. Similarly, I'd argue Steve Player was not an innovator because of his skills in cost accounting, extensive as they were. Steve wrote 7 books. But because he was able to convince institutions to give up the dumb stuff and rip out McKinsey's 100-year-old broken processes.
Change is coming for you. The question is whether you're going to be ready for it and be proactive in terms of dealing with it, in terms of what's out there. We talk about storytelling and impactful reports quite a bit, and think about storytelling. There's always the story that everybody heard. What we're beginning to understand is there are more stories that are out there in terms of different. If you look at it from a slightly different position, there's a new series out on Netflix or Prime, I forget which one. It's called Rosalind. And it takes the classic story of Romeo and Juliet, but rather than the way we've always heard it, it tells it from a different perspective. The story from Rosalind, if you're a Shakespeare fan, you'll remember Rosalind was the girl that Romeo was in love with at the start of the play, and he's lamenting over his lost love, Rosalind. And then she gets basically dumped for Juliet in terms of what's out there. There's a different perspective. We've seen a number of movies, Maleficent, a lot of classical fairy tales about the huntsman, the story of Snow White from the huntsman's point of view. I mean, so you go through, if you change the perspective and think about it, there's a whole different story there to tell. All of us, to be adaptive, have to understand that sometimes the way to figure something out is not to keep hammering it the way you have hammered it, but take a slightly different perspective. And hopefully this issue of planning aces helps people understand, pivot a little bit and take a different perspective. Maybe you see it in a whole new light.
It's startling to me, and perhaps sad to admit, that when I left Consulting Magazine, where I had written hundreds, perhaps thousands of articles and profiles on different consultants, I left without having made friends with one consultant. There was a time I may have attributed this to my so-called journalist objectivity, but I no longer believe that to be true. I do know that when I landed in the world of finance, unbeknownst to me, a consultant had befriended me my very first week.